Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, about 10 days ago, 9, 10 days ago, we did a podcast on regarding how Xi has finally reached the end of his patience with the West and with the United States. Well, it looks like now that patience is turning into action. And we're going to discuss some of the things that are going on with it and how China has finally put the foot down and is no longer going to take any crap from the West. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion. And I think we should start with the response, even before he's been inaugurated as president, to the tariff situation and rare earths.
Yeah, thanks obviously, first off, for joining today as well, Kat. It's great that we get together. We know this been going on for a long time, trying to basically cut China out of the semiconductor sector, trying to cripple Huawei, and it's all failed. We're not here to discuss that particular aspect today, but it's very telling when several Chinese industry associations came out, which includes the Internet Society of China, the China Semiconductor Industry Association, who basically came out and issued a statement going, American chip products are no longer safe or reliable, and relevant Chinese industries will have to purchase American chips with caution. Now, the implication's pretty significant because what this means is China, of course, is in the process of designing its own chipsets. So they will design their products in future that avoids utilizing US chips, clearly, and any US technology. And therefore, that's going to impact businesses in the United States who can ill afford to have these kind of political games played, which are very damaging and detrimental to those businesses. This will see US chip companies, of course, suffer further losses in terms of revenue. Their operations are going to be impacted. Therefore, the argument is if they have less capital coming into the business, then ultimately that's going to impact the future development of new technologies. And it's quite ironic that the US went out of their way to try and cut China off from US semiconductors. And now China's basically issued a statement going, don't purchase them. I mean, when they say purchase them with caution, what they're effectively saying is, unless you absolutely have to, do not purchase these anymore. And that also implies that China's at a point where it largely doesn't need to rely at all on the United States for chips in any way, shape, or form. And now it's in a position to be able to go alone and do what it needs to. Now, that's not entirely true, of course, but it's largely the case. And this is another one of those things with the US. It's like, no, be careful what you wish for, because in this case, it's blown up in their face and it's boomeranged, rather like sanctions did with respect to Russia, with respect to Ukraine. The same principles applying, that China has made huge strides precisely because the US was aggressively trying to cut them out of semiconductor markets and say, we'll cripple China. Well, ironically, this is only going to impact and damage US chip companies. You must be really, really annoyed that US foreign policy is having this effect when it's got nothing to do with the products they produce. But it's just because of the fact that US government policy means China can't trust the US anymore. So it has to take what you might term extraordinary measures to deal with these problems.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it goes even beyond the just the rare earth metals. You have tariffs that are going to be put on, or the sanctioning of products, Chinese products coming in through the online platforms like Amazon, etc. The potential sanctioning of the Chinese equivalent of that, Temu. And I'm sitting here going, the US doesn't produce these type of products, and if they did, they couldn't do them at a comparable price that consumers can afford. So the reality is that the US desperately needs Chinese products, but they're running into that fine line of, okay, well, we need to continue exporting the dollar to China. We need them buying our debt. We need all of this stuff. Those countries aren't doing that anymore, and they're demanding something more substantial for the imports and exports that are coming. So you tack on what China wants to eliminate from the export deal, and then you have the US wanting to cancel the importing of goods that they desperately need even more, at least on the consumer front. And it's a matter of shooting yourself in the foot or in both feet, uh, crippling yourself completely, and then wondering how you're going to get your economy out. Because think about this. Say there is the potential that there are rare earths that are in the ground somewhere in U.S. territory. With our regulatory system and the fact that we first need to geologically find them, then we need to do the environmental scope, and then it will take 10 years before we could potentially bring any new rare earths to the surface to be able to use in an industry that is now in an all-out global war, and I'm talking economic war, to bring AI to the forefront. And all the fears that the US has are built upon their ideological uh, ideological barriers from actually being economically viable, i.e., uh, having cheap energy, nuclear, refineries, any of these things, all the things that the United States has to import, rare earths in this in particular. Even drone technology is made in China for the U.S. military. So the capability and the rhetoric that has come from the Trump administration that we're going to suddenly become self-sufficient, none of this is going to be actual or viable in the time that Trump is in office. So, I think China recognizes that they have the upper hand in all of this, and it's really come to a crossroads where all you have to do is put the thumb down on the scale, not very hard, but just enough. And, what Mexico and Canada did by giving in to Trump and his threats of tariffs and closing the borders and things like that, that won't work with China. That won't work with Russia. It won't work with Iran. It won't work with many of the BRICS or the multipolar world. So even before he gets into office, he's going to have to recognize that the only true reality is he's either going to cast all of these anti-Russia, anti-China, anti-Iran individuals in the commerce departments aside and say, you know what, we have to work with the multipolar world, or we're going to get run over in a very, very short amount of time. Because just like the growth of AI, things are happening fast. And it's not something that you can expect to, well, will succeed in 5 or 10 years. No, you could be run over in 1 or 2 years.
Well, yeah, and to put this in context, what China's proposing in banning exports to the United States is huge. It's a massive problem for the United States immediately, not in 6 months or a year, because effectively they came out with a statement saying, in accordance with the export control law of China and other relevant laws and regulations to safeguard national security. See, they're using the national security stick to beat the US with, because that's what the US says. And it says an interest and fulfill international obligations relating to non-proliferation. It has been decided to strengthen export controls on relevant dual-use items to the US. And this is the export of dual-use items to the US military users or for military purposes is prohibited. So therefore, export licenses will not be granted for dual-use items related to gallium, germanium, antimony, and super hard materials in the US. Also for graphite dual use items exported to the US, with strict end user and end use reviews will be implemented. Organizations and individuals from any country or region who violates the above provisions by transferring or providing relevant dual use items originating from China to US organizations and individuals will be legally held accountable according to law. So, in essence, this ban of exports to the US, and there's a whole list of these rare earths, critical resources, work for the use for US military industry, are obviously hugely important to every aspect of the military industrial complex, so weapon systems, defense technologies, etc. And when you go through the list, it's huge. It's not one or two, it's 15 or 20. Now, we know, for example, if you look at gallium, basically China produces 99% of gallium in the world. Why is gallium important? Because it's used in thermometers, semiconductors, LEDs, and effectively it's highly valued because it can operate at higher frequencies and temperatures compared to traditional silicon-based semiconductors. So it's used in high-speed electronics, even mobile phones, satellite communications, radar systems. And obviously, because it also enables faster signal processing, it's a critical factor in telecommunications infrastructure and data transmission. That's just one example of the problems. Then you've got germanium, which is a semiconductor obviously used in fiber optics, infrared optics, solar cells. The other thing is then you've got graphite. Now that's mostly used for batteries, steel making, foundry facings, lubricants, you name it. They're going to cut that off to the US. And when you go through a list of all these things, like tungsten is basically about 85% manufactured in China. You've got vanadium, which is about 75%, all rare earths, about 75%. Germanium is about 60%, and the list goes on. You've got indium, titanium, antimony, and even things like cobalt. And cobalt's worth mentioning because in principle, most of the just cobalt is mined in Congo, but it's China that processes about 95% of it. Cobalt's essential for aerospace and what you might term portable energy solutions. Is also used in superalloys for jet engine components, gas turbines, rechargeable batteries, which are utilized for portable military electronics. It's also used in drones. That's just, another example of the kind of problems they face. And if you look at rare earths in the broader sense, they actually announced a ban of rare earth extractions and separation technologies back in December of last year, almost a year ago. That has huge implications for the US national economic and rare earth security because that's a group of 17 metals that's used in defense technology, missiles, lasers, vehicle-mounted systems, tanks, military communications. It's used in computers, televisions, smartphones, so-called, clean energy technologies. And at present, China produces about 60% of the world's rare earths, but it actually processes 90%, which means that it's importing rare earths from other countries and processing them. China has a monopoly on this, and it's basically turned around to the United States and gone, you're not having any of this. So, you can go on if you look at things like the importance of tungsten and vanadium, and because tungsten's used in tool steel, cutting tools, vanadium is used to make steel alloys. So it's used in nuclear reactors, aircraft carriers, you name it. And the strength means they're suited for the creation of tools and even girders in construction. So you're going to cut the United States off from everything. And antimony is worth mentioning because that's used to increase the hardness of alloys. I mean, and you obviously use it for machine bearings in batteries. It's also used in automotive clutch and brake parts, but it's also used for the production of flame retardant chemicals through antimony trioxide. I mean, it has military applications. You know, titanium's used in aircraft, spacecraft, and missiles because it can withstand extreme temperatures. And it's used even in laptops. Power plant condensers use titanium pipes because then don't corrode. And the list goes on. Indium's used even in simple things like flat screen telly, solar panels, and it conducts electricity well, bonds strongly to gas, it's transparent. That's just a soft metal, but it's stable in air and water. I mean, and the US is going to get cut off from all of these. This is as bad as it can get for them because, yeah, okay, there's odd ones like niobium, which is largely produced in Brazil. So they'll be able to still have access to that. But how much of that is then shipped to China as opposed to the United States? That's used in alloys, including stainless steel. It may improve the strength of it. So that's used in jet engines, rockets, you name it. Even building oil rigs, oil and gas pipelines. Okay, that's probably not something the US has particular need for it. It also can be used in superconductivity. So the reason why I'm mentioning all these points is just to highlight and emphasize why the United States has huge problems and why we said recently when Xi read Biden the Riot Act and went, enough is enough. They're basically saying to particularly more so to the Trump administration, enough is enough. We're not putting up with this anymore. You think you're going to tariff us. You think you're going to force us to acquiesce to what you think is an acceptable trade policy. It's not happening. And we're not going to tolerate it. And we're now going to start turning the screw. I'm going to turn the screw pretty hard. And as you rightly point out, Ken, for the US, even if it has rare earths, even if it has access to all the aforementioned, to get it into production, assuming that deposits are viable for production, you're going to take at least 10 years. The United States can't, for 10 years, have its supplies cut off to a large extent. And this is why China can make these kind of policy decisions that has huge effect on the US. It's a surprise they've waited this long to do it. But I think they're just laying the law down to Trump going, enough's enough. You're not going to bully us. Let's work together. Because if you don't, we're going to really turn the screw hard and make life extremely difficult for the US. And the thing that will annoy the United States more than anything is the impact it will have on its military industrial complex, not least because it wants to keep producing missiles, etc., to send to Ukraine, as one example, or to give to the Israelis, as another example. And who knows what military conflicts lie in the future. So this is a real hammer blow for the US and should not be trivialized, the extent of the damage this will do to them, and it will do it to them pretty quickly.
Yeah, over the past few years, maybe a decade or so, it's almost been like two boxers in a ring, where the U.S. of course, has is the world champion and has uh, the history behind them, and China is up there, and they're taking the hardest blows that the U.S. can do them over time, but they're staying put. They're acting like a solid rock, and then all of a sudden, when the U.S. tires out and can't really put up the fight that they did a decade ago, then all of a sudden China starts pushing, putting the screws down. So I think that's really what has happened is that China has taken the brunt of the Western both propaganda and seeing all of these military threats over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, Philippines, etc. come onto their doorstep, and they've just been waiting and waiting and waiting. And now they're strong enough and they're secure enough that boom, now the retaliation happens. And it happens first economically at a time when US debt is through the roof, where the economy is assuredly into deep recession. And we've got a change and transition of leadership with half the country, divided against the other half of the country. The U.S. is really at its lowest point, and I think that's also a good transition into what's happening in Europe and what occurred when Baerbock came over to China just a few days ago and met with the foreign minister and tried to pull the same old things, decrying human rights and this and that, and insulting the host country. And China just, didn't even allow a joint press conference, ushered her out, and sent her packing on her way. This is how China is going to deal with the world today. If you give us respect and you want to deal as equals, we're all for it. But if you're going to insult us and treat us like a second class nation, well, we don't have time for you, and we can make your life difficult much more than you can make ours.
Yeah, I mean, in Germany's case, it's self-explanatory. I mean, but this is the problem when you have a government that does everything that's damaging to German business. German business is trying to find ways to get around these problems and is finding it extremely difficult to do so because of stupid, idiotic government policies. I mean, not least, obviously, the energy consideration, but we're not here to discuss that because we've talked about that previously. But it's just to highlight a point that eventually big business in all these Western countries is going to run out of patience completely with governments and say, we're not tolerating this anymore because the damage they're doing to businesses because of stupid policy decision. I mean, if you've got German businesses wanting to go to China, wanting to invest more in China, to grow businesses in China, and then you have a foreign minister who's supposed to be the senior diplomat in your country making very, very contentious statements, telling you you're not supposed to have a relationship with Russia and trying to dictate to you what you can and cannot do by trying to sound tough is ridiculous because unfortunately China is going to take action, and as we've seen, if China takes economic action, then that is going to have an impact on businesses, whether they deal with them directly inside China, maybe a bit less so, but certainly internationally in countries like Germany. And there's going to be consequences because, as we said, China's had enough and it's not going to placate this kind of behavior anymore. It's making its position very clear, and the West needs to wise up quickly and go, we need to work together. It's got to be win-win cooperation, because if it isn't, then China will go and do business somewhere else with someone else, because we need to get over the fact China doesn't need to do business with the West anymore to survive.
Yeah, and as we know, ever since 2008, the U.S. has gone at least 3 times to China, begging them for a pseudo bailout, whether it's buying of treasuries, buying the debt, the silver that they supplied in 2008, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in many ways, the United States is a mirror image of Zelensky. No shame and all hubris. And until that point where you recognize that you're no longer the sole top dog and that you can just carrot and stick your way into pushing anybody to follow your way and your policies, until you start recognizing that you're, as you've pointed out many times, an equal amongst equals, then the United States is just going to drive, and especially Europe, because in a lot of parallels, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, what it has done, and the sanctions against Russia, what it has done to Europe and its economy, is going to be the exact same thing of what these export bans are going to do to the U.S. economy and the U.S. military industrial complex. They're going to fall into deeper recession. They're not going to be able to supply. They're going to have uh, I don't want to say cheaper, but less viable military. All the things that pretty much support this hegemony or hegemony across the world is suddenly going to come collapsing down. And there's going to be, I think, if this stands, this policy stands, and the Trump administration doesn't do some type of negotiations to reopen these markets, I think very quickly over the next 4 years, you're going to see an incredible decline in U.S. power, not just the way it is perceived, but actual power around the world. And you're going to see a pullback into isolation because Trump wants to bring back industry to the U.S. That's what he said. That's what he tried to do during his first term. The interesting thing is China may force the United States to do it, and if that's so, it's going to be very, very painful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with that, I think
Yep, good time
we'll
to
yeah,
bring it to a close. Paul, as always, thank you very much for your support and your insight into this.
yes, and likewise.
And to everybody at the Sirius community, thank you very much for your support as well. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.